All right.
Oh, you're like, look, we're losing good content.
I
Losing
know,
good
yes,
content.
good content. Yeah.
Yes, but I was just inspired by Dean Hikes, and I was like, that's what I want to do. And I
Wow.
researched and discovered this higher ed world, administration, student affairs. And so I started my master's in that like 2006 or something like that, and hadn't looked back. So I have been in academia in some regard since.
What a blessing. That's a blessing because so many people don't always have like the content expertise and the thing that they're trying to lead or do. And so you bring the depth of understanding of like what those women are going through being STEM majors, right? Wanting to go into the field, but then applying like, this context of like supporting them to get through it. And I can imagine so many people go into higher ed, not with a lot of detail around like, not being that type of student or in that particular study area of study.
Yeah, I think that that's what allows me to truly be like a scholar and practitioner. Like when people say that, I'm a scholar practitioner, like I really desire to live in that way. And so I want my research to inform my practice, and my practice informs my research. And so that my authentic leadership article was based out of my dissertation data. Like that came from exploring and talking to women of color, college women of color, and then talking to professional women of color who were still navigating very same things. I'm like, these are 18 to 22-year-olds. And then I have 30 to 50-year-old folks who are still having these same challenges. So this is very much so real, still valid, still necessary. And so for me, that's important for me to write about things that I am living and that I am hopefully able to affect change on, because like I then take that into the classroom and I talk about that to, this emerging STEM generation, to talk about like why it's necessary for you to be in leadership spaces in the context of your engineering degree or your chemistry or your computer science, like, and at the intersections of your identity as a woman, as a person of color. All of those things are who you are, but they are so critical in spaces like STEM and leadership that often have been so dominant grouped, male, white. And so when we haven't been afforded access to those spaces, we have to be strategic when we want to take up those spaces, but then also do that without losing who we are. And so I love being able to, as we, joked earlier about like not loving to read or write. I do, because I know that it has a purpose. And I want to be intentional about the scholarship, that it aligns with like my practice and is coming out of the things I'm seeing day to day, from conversations to, the lessons that I'm teaching in the classroom, to the research that I'm, conference sessions that I might be presenting on. Like I need them to be symbiotic and kind of talk to each other. So I love being able to kind of sit in that space that I can do, like have my hands in both things. Some people might say that I got a little ADHD. And it's like, no, I just like to do, I need to be in all the things. I just want to be in all the things.
Yeah, I love it. I love it so much. So we're just going to keep rolling. We're going to jump into the conversation. I may keep this in here. I may not, I don't know. I myself am working. I mean, I think this connects to authentic leadership. I myself am working on this idea of perfectionism and everything looking a certain way. And so we may edit this, we may not. Fun fact, part of the reason I do lives instead of recordings is because it's live. You can't go back. And I know me, I will get to editing until it's perfect.
But there's a level of vulnerability and honesty that you get to have. And so hopefully we can maintain that.
We will. Well, I want to make sure folks know who we're talking to. We started the conversation, y'all, because Natasha and I are Spelman sisters. So we had to go through that origin story of who you know, how you know them, what you do after you graduate, all of that good stuff. And in that spirit, I know I lived in Manly. And so what was your freshman dorm?
HH5
Omega Noon. Manly. Here we are.
Good love, everybody. Good love.
Love you dearly. But Dr. Natasha Turman is a renowned scholar, advocate committed to interdisciplinary research and practice in the fields of gender, diversity, and critical leadership development in higher education. And I simply just love this in so many ways, because I am a Black woman in leadership. And there's just so much that we deal with, right, in all of these identities. And too often, there will be articles or speakers who speak to one part of that identity. And so when I think about Thrive Life Coaching and what it is I am attempting to do in the community I'm attempting to create, is really creating a space where Black and brown women can bring all of those identities together along with their identity as mothers. Because we are leaders at home, we are leaders in the community, leaders in our profession, and we are also women and mothers. And so love the article that you have written, and invite folks to please be sure to click the link, read the article, Authentic Leadership, Centering Context to Critically Examine Authenticity. And so I just want to hear from you all your just knowledge and just sharing with folks around like why you chose to dig into this research. How have you seen this show up in the women that you work with? How has it personally affected you? And so maybe just start with like, how do you define authentic leadership?
Great questions. Thank you. So start off, thank you for just the invitation, the call to create the space. It is often, I know sometimes when we talk about academia and we talk about like when people are publishing and writing, disclaimer, I do not desire to be a tenure track faculty member for which their calling and whole job is to write and research and publish, but I love to do those things. And I also love to be in community and in practice and with the subjects that I'm trying to present to the world. And so for me, it's really important to not just say, I got to publish and put things out, but that I am doing things that are going to inform my practice or that were birthed out of my practice. And so this particular topic, actually, as a self-proclaimed, I guess, or donned as from a training perspective, leadership educator, so to speak. I have always been fascinated with wanting to understand how folks who look like me engage in leadership practice and show up in those spaces. And from the existing literature, right, that's there wasn't a space that critically explored, especially authentic leadership. And when we talk about leadership theories, right, there's a canon of theoretical perspectives, great man theory and all these different types of leadership theoretical perspectives. And authentic leadership is one of those. And it's a younger theory. But even if you didn't know the theory, people understand what authenticity is. And that is a trait that many folks hold others to a standard, and we often hold ourselves to this standard of authenticity. But what exactly does that look like when we talk about in leadership? And even that word leadership, particularly women, folks of color, don't don that title for themselves. I have a cohort of 105 first-year students, and this whole semester we're talking about leadership within the context of STEM, right? And I ask the question every semester, like, how many of you would raise your hand and call yourself a leader? 30, maybe a third of the class, maybe, would raise their hands. Right. And all of them are women or other gender minoritized identities. And it's so fascinating to me that in 2024, that is still a perpetual thing that you don't identify. You would not call yourself a leader, because for many, and especially folks who hold minoritized identities like women and folks of color, that is something that others have to see you as. Like, it's about others' perception of you. So you may be doing all of the traits of a leader. You may be affecting change. You may be trying to implement the newest thing. You may be supporting others. All of the traits that embody leadership you are doing, but you won't give yourself that title, because if someone else externally has not donned it onto you, then it doesn't make it real. And so that's a unique tension that I have to like unpack for my students, because they're like, well, I mean, I feel like I'm being arrogant if I call myself a leader. And I need others to see that I'm a leader and believe that I am possessing the traits and skills of a leader. before I would call myself a leader. And so when we kind of circle back to this like authentic leadership conversation, first of all, there's already a disconnect between people calling themselves a leader. And then you overlay like, oh, are you being a genuine leader? Are you, you know, everyone's interpretation of that is very different. But when you hear authenticity, people think of genuineness. They think of like good character. They think of you being your whole self and unapologetically being like your most full version of who you are in your leadership. The reality is that that is a privilege to be able to do. And so when I think about what authentic leadership should look like, right, even though how it manifests is a little bit different, I realize that that's going to look very different in the context of my identities. And so how real and unapologetic I get to be depends on the space. That's why I said context matters. It depends on the space that I'm operating in that will determine whether or not I feel like I can bring my whole self and it be received as genuinely and as authentically as I am trying to present it, or if it's going to be kind of boxed into whatever stereotypes and preconceived notions that you have of who I am or what you believe folks who look like me are. And so it's a unique tension that often is not dealt with because people just assume that everyone should aspire to be genuine and honest and have integrity and, you know, be their best selves. Yes, that is true. However, in reality, that's a privilege, and folks who hold dominant identities are the ones that are usually afforded that privilege to do the most authentic things without question, without you know, anyone wondering if they have, you know, ulterior motives to their practice and things of that nature. And so it's an important conversation, and it really kind of emerged in my dissertation research, talking to 18 to 20-year-old high achieving women of color who were pursuing, you know, who are in different leadership roles at the college level. But then as I would have conversations with my peers and my Spelman sisters, realizing that they were still navigating the same things that these college students were navigating. So it doesn't go away. There's a very real challenge of like, how do I bring my whole self to these spaces and people be receptive to what I'm bringing and will allow me to like be all of who I feel like I want to be in those spaces. And then how do I do that without losing myself? You know, how do I do that without someone, again, ascribing their stereotypes or, you know, norms and values onto me. And so it makes what others would feel should be simple, it makes it a little bit more complex when we take in light identities and lived experiences and people's social locations. Like you can't be devoid of that. And that is really what I just want to like emphasize, is that you have to hold these things, you know, in tandem with one another, because it's not just, oh, you're not being authentic. No, there's some other dynamics that are at play that maybe are necessitating that I can't be that way. Right. Absolutely. It doesn't mean that I'm not being genuine. It doesn't mean that I am being a fake leader or that I don't care about the folks that I'm supporting. It just might also mean that for my safety and my sanity, this is how I have to show up in these spaces. And so often people struggle trying to find that balance. And others struggle because they're like, oh, why do you feel so like closed off? Or like, I feel like I don't know anything about your life. Or, you know, like, because you don't necessarily get to have all access to me. I am choosing what part.
Natasha, I want to spin around in this chair right now. I mean, and this is real talk, real conversation. And I honestly can say, I wish I had this research, I had this article 10 years ago, right? When I became a principal, and literally what people would say is, I had folks say, you're stuck up, you're standoffish. And what I didn't have the language for is what you said, is I don't know how much of my real self I can give to you safely, right? As a principal, right? And let's add Black woman, right? Was not a mother then, but in terms of age, was extremely young for the role. And so all of these identities, and I'm like, I don't know how to exhibit who I truly am safely, right? and maintain my job,
knowing and still lead in the way that you all are accustomed to.
Exactly.
People who don't look like me leading, right?
Exactly.
Because you're still holding me to that standard. So I can't just be my collaborative self, or if I feel like I value collective leadership, but you want very hierarchical, top down, then you giving me other adjectives to like, oh, you're being a bossy, you're being this, you're being that.
Exactly.
And so it's like you're in a rock and a hard place, and it's really hard to negotiate that. And I feel like there is a different, there's just a different level of vulnerability that you have to be, and people don't give that grace to know that you're still negotiating that. It's either you are or you aren't. And, oh, I don't like working for women leaders. You know how many times I've heard people say that?
Yes.
Like, I don't like women leaders are so this, they're so that. And I'm like,
but or Black women. Or
and
Black women.
Then add that.
I hear it from my Black women sisters who say, I will not work for a Black woman.
Yep. And I'm like, do you realize what they are navigating, what they are having to negotiate to just, one, have access to that space and maintain their access to the space, like the strategy that they are having to exert to stay, to get there and then stay, and then to be respected on top of that, and then for you to value their direction. And for you to not be holding them to an unnatural standard that they shouldn't be held to, because you're not holding mediocre white men to those standards. But I digress. But so it's a really hard place. And so when I hear that, I kind of cringe, because I'm like, y'all just don't understand. Like no Black woman, a brown woman that's in leadership is trying to make their lives complicated. They're not trying to be the least liked person. Like, that is not what they're trying to do. No. The reality, though, is that you are navigating an organization that was not designed with you in mind. Yeah. And 9 times out of 10, while you were overly qualified to get there, you're probably one of the few still there. And so you are underrepresented and then expected to overperform, because that is our norm that we do. We 2 times work twice as hard. And so you're doing all of that. And then it's like, oh, well, you're not being your real self. Well, tell me when I got time. Like,
because you also want me to execute and perform in this way.
And so, like, for people to feel like if you're not being your authentic self and leading, that, then I can't trust you, and I can't, I can't follow you. Right. We talk about followership. And it's an unfair dichotomy, I think, that folks, and particularly women of color, have to traverse. And I wish that were not the case. And so that's really one of the reasons, I know, like, I went down to mulberry bush, but that's really one of the reasons I hope that this conversation will resonate with folks, because I need people to understand that that it's out of necessity. And the ways in which I have to negotiate parts of myself in terms of this conversation around authenticity, it's real. And it's not just like someone picking and choosing that I'm going to be this type of way today, and then tomorrow I'm going to be like this with you. It's like, no, actually, let me look around in the space and all right, I heard the rhetoric that was, in the last board meeting. So let me think about how I need to respond, how I need to show up in these spaces so that I can thrive, right? I need to be here. I know that folks who look like me are often not afforded access to spaces like that I'm in. So it's a lot. It's a lot to balance. It's a lot to hold constant. And then to be met with someone questioning whether or not you are being your whole self. Again, in this place and in this time and in this context, this is how much of myself you get. Now, catch me outside at homecoming.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, in different environments, or even if the dynamics of your team might look different, you may have a different level of vulnerability that you're willing to present, right? But that is the agency that you have, and that is actually a powerful thing that you're able to have, and it's not a deficit, right? That's an asset. And I think sometimes we position it as a deficit, but I'm like, no, it's actually an asset to be able to strategically decide how you're going to show up in those spaces. And I think it's not being, again, disgenuine at all. It's just saying that if you recognize that my safety is on the line, you would appreciate that I am being intentional.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this, because you're beginning to discuss it a bit around this navigation. And in your research, you discuss code switching, which I think is a pretty familiar term, right, for minoritized people who find themselves, especially in white dominant spaces or spaces where they're marginalized, where, you know, we code switch in terms of how we may speak, our tonality, like whatever that may be. But you also raise a term that was new to me called impression management. And so talk with me a little bit around what that is and how it shows up in the workplace.
Yeah, they're kind of like two sides of the same coin, right? And so code switching is the ways in which you are going to manage yourself, right? So maybe, you know, people are like, "Oh, you're talking real extra proper," or, you know, even how you adjust your hair. Like, as Black women, our hair, you know, there's the reason that there's a Crown Act, right? Like, there is tension around showing up in our full, unique, and original selves, right? And so having to decide how I'm going to present myself, how am I going, the language that I might use, the choice words that I'm going to use in certain spaces and in certain contexts, right? That's part of that code switching. You know, I love corporate Aaron, right? Yeah. On, you know, social media, but like that is like a very probably like over the top code switching, right? But we literally do it all the time, because you could really be having a conversation with a friend and you are a little bit more casual, and then you need to hop on a Zoom call with a board member and you're going to adjust accordingly, right? Because that's part of the impression. That's part of the managing of impressions, because you want to make sure that no one questions your competency, that no one questions whether or not you are qualified and that you should be doing what you're doing. And so that impression management is making sure that that narrative never gets questioned, that doesn't get tainted. And so that's why I said it's kind of like two sides of the one side of each coin, because they kind of work in tandem with each other. So I am making sure that how I'm presenting myself, how I'm interacting with you, make sure that you have an understanding that I fit, that I belong.
Yes.
And so I am, and everyone, you know, who dominant identities too, they are they're managing your impression of them too, but maybe for different reasons, right? Because they're not necessarily stereotypes around their identity groups, but maybe they're like, I just want to make sure that you know that I am qualified. But for folks of color and women of color, I want to make sure that you know that I am competent and that I'm overly qualified. Like, I know this in and out, around the corner and back and forth. And so that is part of that impression, that I want to make sure that you don't have an unequivocal doubt that I belong here, that I know my stuff, and that I'm going to get the job done. Absolutely. And so I think those two things kind of work in tandem together. And so when we talk about like authenticity, you are on top of trying to like manage how other people perceive you doing the work, then you are having to govern yourself in a certain way. So that's that code switching. It makes it real hard to say like, this is authentically who I am. No, this is what I need to do to make sure that you don't question that I know what I'm doing and that I belong in this space. It's exhausting. It's a lot. There's so much labor, especially when you hold minoritized identities, trying to show up authentically. It's labor intensive. And so we would love to just be our unapologetic whole selves. But the reality is that your impression of me, because of, again, systemic racism and bias and stereotypes and all of those things, you have an interpretation of my identity groups. Like, everyone has these stereotypes and biases, you know, so insert group here, insert minority group there. So I'm aware of that. I don't have the privilege of ignoring that. So I have to navigate that, knowing that, and making sure that I manage how you think you're perceiving me in that space. And so it's a lot. It is. It's exhausting too.
So exhausting. Talk with me a little bit around generationally. Because I would assume, I was reading somewhere and understanding, so like we're millennials, and then we've got our Gen Xers, and then I guess next are Gen Alpha, who are like the children, right?
I'm like, I don't know which one. Which one are we on?
I'm making sense of all of it, right? And so do you find generationally there are differences? So I go back and we are proud Spelman women. We are extremely proud, but I can go back to, I was in Women in Leadership. Was it Well or Will? The program we had at Spelman. And we were taught how you show up, that black suit, that white collared shirt, right? You better have
but respectability politics. And when you overlay the historical part.
And so that is how we were taught. And so when I showed up to be a principal, I was suited and booted most days, right? Like you gon' I don't want you to question anything about me down to my dress, right?
That was managing others' impressions of you, because you never wanted you were younger, principal, and you wanted to make sure that they knew that you deserved to be there. You were qualified and competent in your principalship, right? And so that was also reflected in your attire. And you're absolutely right. It is generational, because I'm like, I feel old. I'm like, these young folks, they up here like, I'm up here. I'm just like, wait, let me clutch my pearls. What?
Yeah.
Why don't you have on, And I realized that is how we were socialized, right? Yes. And so it's all a socialization. And, I am a little envious, right, of the younger generations, because they actually are able to be a little bit more unapologetic than I feel like older generations are. But at some, it's still a cost, right? Because in certain spaces, because they haven't figured out that balance, right? And so they want to be that unapologetic version of themselves in every space,
everywhere,
and they don't realize that not every space is ready for it. And so then they're like, oh, I'm not gonna be fake, I'm not gonna be inauthentic, I gotta be my whole self. You see that code switch right there? And so people are they struggle, because they're like, I don't want to work for that organization if you're not going to accept me for who I am. And that's your prerogative, right? That is totally your prerogative. The reality is that not everyone has that luxury to walk away from positions or organizations, and they have families, they have just lived, they got to take care of themselves. And so it makes it, I feel like that is even a privilege. It's just a generational privilege to be able to say, I can walk away from this. Like, if you're not going to accept me for who I am, then I don't want any part of it. And I believe that, again, I wish that was an ability that everyone was afforded. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But it is very much so generational, because I think we were socialized to present in a certain way, and then having the Southern overlay of that. There's respectability politics in that. There is making sure that, again, when you are a part of the upper echelon, so to speak, of academia from a historically Black, college experience, you also feel like you have the ancestors looking at you, making sure that you are, representing the collective in the best light. And so, but again, if you don't take people's lived experiences and all of that into consideration, then you will water down their essence and full understanding of exactly how they are making meaning of the spaces that they're in, let alone trying to do someone's leading, right? They're existing and having to make all these negotiations. Just the code switching and impression management is an everyday tactic. Aside from leading, like, you are doing that just to live. And so then to add that in spaces where you're also trying to lead, it's a compounding. And I think that has to just be named, because sometimes they're considered in isolation. And I'm like, no, these are tethered experiences. And so we got to make space for all of that.
Love it. Yeah. I want to highlight something before I move to our next question, something I don't think we talk about enough, but I have certainly made sense of. Both of us are Southerners. So you from Virginia, I'm from North Carolina, and we both have spent time at PWIs outside of the Southern region. And for myself, when I was at Harvard, and for yourself at the University of Michigan, I would imagine that we have both taken into consideration this idea of regionality and just how we show up in spaces and engage with people. So it's yes, language, but it's also just the interpersonal engagement. Like, for me, leadership, particularly as a Southern Black, like you speak to folk when you walk into a room. You say hello and you say good morning and you wait for the person, small things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas in different environments, right, you just don't get that. And I think so often we don't think about the regionality of this as a part of our identity. And especially if you're a Southerner, it is just extremely strong in some of the things we do that we don't realize when we leave the South, like, oh,
that's very real. And I would probably get fussed at because someone would be like, you are not being authentic, because I am a Jersey girl. I am a Virginian. I am a Virginian by way of New Jersey. And so there are contexts. So your point is valid, 1,000%, because there are contexts where Jersey comes out. And then there are contexts where the Southern Belle from Virginia in Georgia, come to the scene. And so I hold all of those, together, and how I have to negotiate how I'm going to show up in certain spaces. And so being in the Midwest, from Chicago to now Michigan, they move different. Everyone interacts differently. And so we often talk about, in corporate world, cultural competency and the importance of cultural competency, but it's not just international cultural competence, right? Like that regional cultural competency is also critical. And it will shape and inform how you do leadership. And you have to know that's part of that context. You have to know the context that you're operating in. So maybe how I'm going to show up, if I was up north in Jersey and interacting in that space, will look a little different than how I would show up in the South or even in the Midwest or even out in Cali, because their priorities, their goals, what they, that everything's just different. And so you have to be aware of that. Just as unique as organizations are, you have to know that geographically, that's going to shape and inform how people receive you. And so that impression that you're giving off needs to be in context, and in concert with, I guess, the region that you're also navigating, because your authenticity, you could be being your authentic self, but it may not be the right.
It's not going to read well.
Right. It may not read well in certain spaces. So you got to know your audience, and you have to know how you need to show up so that they can understand what you're trying to get across. And that still is being authentic. You are just being strategic. You are making sure that you are aware of the context, the audience, the environment, so that you can get the work that you need to get done, and then you can be effective as a leader or even a follower in those spaces. Like you're going to be supporting, I struggle with that whole leader follower dichotomy, but I also know that when we talk about leadership on a meta level, that's often how people see it, that there's one person. I value collective leadership and collaborative leadership. And so I want my team to feel like they are just as much a part of the conversation and the decision making as I am. But I also know that when you have organizations that have hierarchy, there's going to be a leader and there's going to be some designated followers. And so, I got to name that. As much as I, value the collaboration, and there's still going to be someone that's going to be designated the authority figure to make some changes, to make decisions, to put their stamp of approval on something. And so I just want to name that, because sometimes people are like, that's just not a real version of leadership. And I'm like, but it is. But I also know that I got to traverse the space that values this very hierarchical leadership model, and doesn't mean that I'm going to be devoid of how I also operate, and that in my team we're going to be very collaborative. I still know that that's how other people are viewing it too. But
absolutely,
that's my soapbox for the day.
I'm just saying, I get it. In your research, you suggest when individuals have the agency to show up in ways most authentic to them, code switching becomes an asset, not a liability. And so you mentioned this before as it being an asset. Just talk a little bit more about that and the ramifications of that, right? This idea that one's ability to code switch is actually an asset for them. And just say more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you come from the K through 12 world, right? And we talk about like deficit, or fixed mindsets versus a growth mindset, right? And when I think about how the concept of code switching often gets positioned, it's seen in a negative viewpoint, and it's very, from a deficit perspective, very fixed. And it's like, oh, if you have to do that, then you're not being real, you're not being who you are. But when we actually just recognize that my ability to be observant and to know my audience and to know the culture, to know the context that I am traversing, that's a skill set. And it's often not presented in that way. And so people feel ashamed that they are having to code switch, or that they're having to, adjust their demeanor or adjust their behavior. And so when it's presented in a negative light, then you're like, oh, I don't want to be viewed as someone code switching because I don't feel like I'm being real and I'm not being genuine. But if we recognize that, you know what, this person has a strategic ability, like that's an asset to have on my team, for someone to know and be aware and cognizant, and then be able to adjust on the dime.
Very quick.
Like, you understand, and it's not just folks of color and women of color who code switch. Like, dominant groups, they do this too, and they know how to navigate the golf course and the boardroom, and those show up very differently.
Right.
But that's still code switching, right? But when we do it, we don't see it as an asset, because it's like, oh, I'm not being my real self. And it's like, actually you are, because you are making sure you protect your peace, physically protect yourself sometimes, right? But also you are making sure that what you have to convey and your ideas and how you're leading are going to land how they need to land, without any other, I won't say noise per se, but just like the unnecessary barriers and things that might be naturally present. When you control how you're going to show up in them, then you get to control that narrative, and you get to decide, all right, I know the audience that I'm navigating. I know what my goals are for this touch point that I'm going to have, right? And so this is what I need to do. This is how I'm going to present myself. This is how I'm going to convey my ideas, so that I can get the outcome that I need to get, right?
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't make you inauthentic. It makes you strategic. And I just wish language has power, right? And I think sometimes we give it a negative connotation, when the reality is that, no, like, actually, that's a skill set. That's a leadership skill set that we should be. When Tara Yoso, one of my favorite higher ed scholars, talked about community cultural wealth, and came up with like 6 forms of capital that communities of color use to like traverse dominant spaces. And they were like aspirational capital, navigational capital, goodness, Tara, don't fight me because I forgot some of the capitals. They were in my dissertation. But one of the capitals that I wanted to add to that list of capitals, because it's like, okay, I know how to, as a person of color, having navigational capital means that I know how to strategically navigate different environments that weren't designed with me in mind. Familial capital is another one. Social capital is another one as well. And so being able to leverage all of those different types of capital, I don't necessarily have to have financial capital, but I am still in a way that I have, linguistic capital is one of the other capitals. So being multilingual, having your family to support you, having, whether it's your chosen family or your biological family, the network that you're leaning into from a social capital perspective. And I'm like, add to this list of capitals, being able to code switch, I call, is like a covering capital. So being able to protect, cover parts of who you are, so that I can use that navigational capital, so that I can use that social capital to get into certain spaces, so that I can have folks who will sponsor me. We talk about having mentors, but let me tell you about the power of a sponsor. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so I need to know how to do all of those things. And I'm like, that is a skill set.
Yes.
You know how many people don't have to deal with that on a day-to-day. And so for you to be able to do all of those things, and still do the work, I'm like, come on, sis, like that's an asset. That is a skill. And I just wish that we would celebrate it in that way, instead of people feeling ashamed that they had to, again, govern themselves maybe a little bit different in that environment versus if they were at the family picnic. Everybody's governing themselves a little bit differently at the family picnic versus, being in the boardroom. Yes. And again, people that we can get down the whole rabbit hole of like respectability politics and all of that. But the reality is that you can go to another country, you could be in the United States. People are still going to be expecting you to show up in their mind models of how work functions and how leaders function. And so that's part of that socialization.
Right.
That is what it is. And so you can decide if you're going to disrupt it. You can decide if you're going to align yourself with it, or if you're going to navigate it strategically to say, like, I know that I need to be in this space because there's no one who looks like me in this space, and I'm going to take up this space. I have the right to take up this space. Simultaneously, I also know that because no one looks like me who has ever looked like me has been in these spaces, or very few, then I still have to navigate other people's stuff.
Yeah.
Whatever that stuff is. And so I got to do all of these things in concert with one another, and knowing how to dialectically hold these things at the same time.
Right.
Like, that's a skill set. And I just need people to be like, I am a boss, because I can do that. Like, I know how to hold all these things.
Yeah.
And I am still being who I want to be.
Yes.
This is still me, right? But I am making sure that I am still whole, because also no one has time to be burnt out and tired. So when we talk about our identities as mothers, as partners, and all of those things, like, that's a lot to then have to navigate. And so again, at what cost? Like, there's a lot that is at stake. So if that means that that's what I can give you, if that's what I taught my students, we learned last week about leadership capacity, right? If this is what I have the capacity, right, to do, and the capacity to show up, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Right. Because I don't have to be perfect. We talked about perfectionism a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
I can't afford to be perfect, but I can afford to be intentional.
Absolutely. I love it. There's so much reframing that you offered, Natasha, and I wrote it down, this idea of, if you're going to be choosing to work in these spaces, right, you can disrupt it, right, which there's a mental cost to that. You can leave it. There's a mental cost to that, right? Or you can navigate it strategically, right? You have choices. Choose your hard, right? That's what I hear you saying. Choose your hard. And what I love about this is because I feel like for a long time, or at least how code switching was introduced to me, especially like coming out of high school and like going into new spaces, it was very assimilating, right? You're assimilating, you're trying to assimilate. I recall, being in advanced placement classes, right, in high school, and being one of the only Black students in that space, and realizing, what I'm doing, right, I'm code switching. I'm sure I got some of this language when reading Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's, our former Spelman president, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, right? And making sense and understanding what are some of these coping mechanisms, right? Not realizing that these are mechanisms that we need to use even now, right? As leaders, right? As good and grown adults, to navigate in this world that we live in. So I love this. I love this. I want to make sure that we leave with some practical, just kind of things that folks can make sense of. We've got the disrupt it, leave it, and navigate it strategically. But let's say we're going to make the choice to navigate it strategically. What would you offer to Black and Brown? It's actually going to be a two-part question. What would you offer to Black and Brown mothers on their journey towards authentic leadership and success to navigate it strategically? And what might we offer to folks who are creating those spaces, right? Who are in charge of these spaces, whether it be academia or our workplace, for people to show up as their authentic and their full range of themselves.
You need to act the Congress for this second question.
Just wanted to put it out there.
Because the reality is that so often we always ask of people in the system to fix the system. And the reality is that the system needs to fix itself. But it doesn't mean that we can't try to, put a little dent in it. But when we talk about systemic barriers and challenges, like that's some big picture things that require some policy, require some people unlearning things. And when I think about the system that I navigate, which is higher education, there's a legacy of systemic barriers that are ingrained, from the ways that faculty teach to the ways that the admissions team recruits and retains students to this campus, to the ways in which just, scholarships are distributed, right? All of those things are systemically, anchored. And so one of my most impactful books I remember reading in grad school was like The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. And the reality is that not just white people have a possessive investment in whiteness, right? Folks of color, you know, immigrant folks, like people who want to buy into this ecosystem, into this way of living. And so that might then prompt you to align yourself or buy into, so to speak, systems that maybe don't have your best interests, but you are like, this is the dream. I've arrived. I've gotten here. I'm now the CEO. I am now the da 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 da. But then you find yourself having to negotiate facets of who you are to keep the space, right? Because it's like, oh, well, I either have gotten here as one of the first or only. So then there's this level of tokenism that comes into place when we're talking about the big picture. I'm kind of tethering your two questions together a little bit.
Absolutely.
But, I think that we have to stop tokenizing folks of color, particularly women of color, other gender minoritized and racially minoritized folks in leadership spaces, whether it's higher education or corporate, and really try to think about, like, what do we want our organization to stand for? What is our mission? What is our vision? What are we actually trying to do? And who are the people not at the table that need to be at the table to help us get there? And, you know, there's an attack, especially from higher ed, there's an attack on DEI right now in many facets. And so it's hard to talk about why this matters and how you're going to be your most authentic self when maybe just your existence alone is under fire. So I can hear someone be like, girl, stop. Like, you want me to be, you know, authentic, da da da. I can't do that when my own practice is not even fully received, or just me existing as a considered a diversity hire for my company. And I might lose my job because of just who I am. Right. And so that's part of that strategic navigation for me, is like understanding and knowing the system that you're in, the organization that you are part of, right? Knowing at what cost, right? And because, you know, this is an analogy that I teach my students, even from when I was teaching doctoral students. So often we can be very passionate, and we are like, we have a cause, and this is me being authentic, and I'm going to show up, you know, whether I'm a grad assistant or entry level professional, or, you know, the dean or whatever. I want to be my unapologetic self, and I'm going to tell people about it, and I'm going to disrupt. I'm going to I'm going to do all these things, right? And what that often then comes off across as is you being it's fire. So we're in parallels to fire, right? And you can have the passion. Fire burns bright, right? It is fire. You will see it. Everyone will see it. They will know that you are not playing games. The problem with fire, though, is that you don't get to control the direction that it burns. You don't get to control what it burns down either. And so in the process of disrupting and being a firecracker, right, you find yourself out on a limb by yourself. You find yourself in a house that you accidentally burnt down. So now you have no allies. Now you have no resources. Now you don't have the support mechanisms that you need because you are your authentic whole self, right? The inverse of that, though, is still being authentic, right? And the strategy part, the strategic, the intentionality is saying, you know what? I know that I am in a system. And I know that I need to have key actors who are I need interest convergence. I need to be able to, you know, have allies and folks on my, you know, that understand my goals and my mission, right, to achieve X. And that's what strategic leaders do all the time. They're like, who do I need to have to back this idea? Who do I need to have on this team that I need to hire to make sure that we can get to this goal, right? And so you are like water at that point, because water ebbs and flows. Water knows how to fill into cracks. It knows where the places and where the gaps are, right? And so if you're being strategic and you know that I need to protect my peace, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm all these things, but also I'm passionate about this project. And so what do I have the capacity to do first, right? And then how am I going to strategically do that? Who do I need to be on my team? Who do I need to get on board to understand this? And so I'm going to navigate like water, not fire, because one, I don't have the capacity for all of this. And two, I need to make sure that when I need something again, that I'm going to make sure that I get it that it can happen. I'm not being fake. I'm not being inauthentic. I'm being strategic. And so I am ebbing and flowing. I am filling into spaces. I am looking, I'm researching, I'm understanding the organism that I am a part of, right? So that I can get the end goal. And so I think just being able to understand leadership in that way and understanding that sometimes I need to be a firecracker. Sometimes I need to burn some stuff down, right? But also, I also might need to navigate like water, and I need to be able to ebb and flow and strategically fill into spaces and places that would allow me to do that safely, that will allow me to still be who I want to be and show up how I want to show up, but also that's in light of the context that I have understood that I am in. And so I think that those are just like I think, from an organizational perspective, we got to be intentional about what we say we mean and like what we say we value. But then as actors in those organizations, we have agency. And if we don't like something, we can't just I won't say we can't. You may not find it effective to just off the rip say, this is not working. I don't like this, we need to fix this. You need to start to learn how to intentionally navigate that space, know the context that you're navigating. And I tell my students this, my student leaders, I'm like, you all, listen, you can't, SGA is not going to just, it's not going to just change. Like, or that's not just going to happen. Housing's not going to just change this. You have to know how to strategically understand your audience and navigate it in a more thoughtful way. And that protects you, that protects your peace too, because you will be pulling your hair out, wondering why this is an uphill battle, but you were trying to be like fire. So you kept burning down the ladder. You kept burning it down.
Wow.
I know those are not bulleted advice, but like, I think that's like a big picture for me is like, that's how I try to model myself. That's how I try to navigate my work. I love what I do, but it doesn't come without challenges, right? It doesn't mean that I'm not navigating a humongous system called the University of Michigan that operates in silos. And so I know that I need to be able to support all of my students and my team. Who do I need to strategically connect with? How do I need to build partnerships and alliances so that I can ultimately get my goal accomplished? And that for me is me being authentic. That is me showing up as Tasha, right? That is me knowing that I'm passionate about this. I'm an activator. And so I see something, I'm going to make it happen. But how I go about making it happen is going to be in context. And I'm going to try to be as intentional and do it collaboratively, because that's one of my values as a leader is that I'm going to do it in community with others so that I can accomplish it. Will there be challenges? Absolutely. Will I not accomplish all of those goals? Absolutely. But it's not going to be at the expense of who I am or my sanity, right? And I'm going to leverage all of my skill sets to try to do that as strategically and as painlessly as possible.
Wow. So powerful, Natasha. What I'm leaving with is if one chooses, to stay and navigate strategically, you can choose to be fire, and to burn things down, or you can choose to be water and fill up space, You have a choice. And at the end of it all, it's our choice, understanding the context, understanding our capacity and what we're able to do, not do, and what we're willing to do or not do, as we navigate these spaces. So powerful. I'm going to attempt to show, I did it, article here in case you have somehow missed it. You can find the article if you have not read it. It is extremely powerful. Authentic Leadership, Centering Context to Critically Examine Authenticity by Dr. Natasha Turman. Please take a read at it. Please interact with it, download it. I think that matters, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I something, just using the article, for example, it's open access, right? Yes. So oftentimes, like when people write scholarship, we writing for other researchers. And I'm like, I need people who are not in this world to see this. Yes. And so being able to take capital to say, I can make this open access so that anyone can read it. It's important to me. Like, I don't want to hold on to insights. Like, I need this to go beyond academia, right? I need this to go to other spaces. And so I am grateful for you sharing that and hoping that people find it useful. It definitely was birthed out of love from my research and being able to interface with some amazing students of color and professional women of color. And, you know, really has inspired how I move and how I want to show up as a leader in spaces and cultivate the next generation of leaders. So it's really important, and it grounds a lot of how I show up and I want to show up for others.
I love it. I love it. We know you do this work in higher ed, but I really think this article is so relevant to women in any industry across lots of ecosystems. If you could let folks know how they can follow your work, how they can stay in touch with you.
Definitely. Listen, I'm trying to be like the cool kids, and so I am on LinkedIn. You know, I'm like, I might look young, but I still act like I'm old school, and I'm like, what's a LinkedIn? What? But definitely, please follow me on LinkedIn. I am in all of the leadership networks, from International Leadership Association to the Leadership Educators Institute, NASPA, one of our student affairs organizations. I believe that leadership is interdisciplinary, and so I strive to show that interdisciplinary nature. So showing up in STEM context to corporate context, like those are all the spaces that I want to traverse and navigate. And I hope that people see that this is not just, you know, unique to higher education, right? But that it is something that we see in our day-to-day lives, from someone who's an entrepreneur to someone who might be a farmer. You know, like, it doesn't have to be this formality that we often ascribe to leadership. It doesn't require a position, right, to do leadership and to be authentic in the ways in which you are affecting change. For me, that is what leadership is how do I affect change in whatever sphere of influence that I have. And so I hope that others this will resonate with others, regardless of what sector they are in, as they're just trying to show up and be who they want to be in the spaces that they're trying to affect change.
Excellent. Natasha, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.